Hi, so this is our seventh lecture about deep learning. This one is about more specifically computer vision. And so we're going to see what are some fundamental tasks of computer vision, what are the standard networks to solve them. And in the end, I will also present some PyTorch tools, precisely the data loader to deal with very large data sets. And we will see a bit of so-called neurosurgery, so how to combine layers from pre-existing networks and fine-tune them and do some complicated training procedure. So we start with the list of tasks on datasets from the computer vision community. So they are mostly on the three tasks we are going to see today are classification, object detection, and semantic or instance segmentation. But of course, it's just a subset of all the problems you may want to solve regarding processing images and videos. In particular, there are other tasks such as tracking, all the geometry-related tasks such as pose estimation, 3D reconstruction, body pose estimation, and then there are even semantic extractions such as auto-captioning, etc. So we won't see this because there are so many things we could spend a full semester just on those topics. But those three main ones, classification, object detection, and semantic or instance segmentation, are really in some ways the bulk of the problems to solve. So let's go quickly through the standard datasets. So we have already seen MNIST, which is a 10-class grayscale small images dataset. Another one was proposed last year by Zalando, which is exactly the same in terms of number of samples, number of classes, resolution, etc. But it's cute because instead of being digits, there are outfit items such as shoes and dresses and trousers. So it's a drop-in replacement. If you have experiments running with NIST, you can easily have additional figures in your article or your thesis by just using this data set instead of MNIST. Another one we have already seen is CIFAR and CIFAR 100, which are basically color version of MNIST proposed in 2009. A very important data set is ImageNet. So in some sense, it's one of the reason deep learning is so successful for computer vision is that this data set really provide a number of samples and number of classes that allow to scale everything up greatly. So I think it's constantly updated even now. So at the moment when I did this slide, there were 20,000. So it's built upon WordNet, which is a hierarchy of words, and the classes are synsets, so which are sets of synonyms, so corresponding in some way to the leaves of the WordNet hierarchy. And in the full data set at the moment, there are 20,000 classes, 14 million images, and 1 million images have been labeled with bounding box annotations, which means rectangles around objects present in the scene. The standard subset of ImageNet, which is used for computer vision, is the one that was used for a challenge in 2012. And it has 1,000 classes and 1,200,000 training examples and 50,000 validation images. So usually when people say ImageNet in computer vision, this is the set they have in mind. So ImageNet is accessible through the web. It's so large that they provide a web interface to browse it, and it's very interesting to look at. So for instance here it's a screenshot where we have the Persian cat synset, which is a subset of domestic cat, which is a subset of domestic animal, which is a subset of animal, and those are examples of images from this synset. The ground truth looks like this. So here I took one image from the Persian cat synset, and going with this image you have a file like this, XML file, so it's structured with the XML syntax, and basically it states mostly where are the objects. So in that case it states that you have an object with this identifier at this location. So this is the description of the bounding box around the object, x minimum, y minimum, x maximum, y maximum, and you have two targets. So if you really extract this information and plot the rectangles on the image, this is what you get. So it just to give you a sense of the type of data we are dealing with. So 1 million of images, and for each of them, this kind of ground truth. More recently, there was several datasets proposed for semantic segmentation. So semantic segmentation is a task where you really try to classify individual pixels according to their class. So for the Seascapes dataset, it's a bunch of images taken in cities from driving cars. You have 30 classes for pixels, so those ones like flat, human, vehicle, etc. And you have 5,000 images with fine annotation and 27 images with coarse annotations. So it looks like that. So you can imagine how expensive it is to get this kind of ground truth because it's really labeled at the pixel level. So if you go to any pixel, you know which class it is. So this is a fine annotation. Then you have the coarse annotation where the boundaries are not as precise, but still may be useful because you can combine both the sort of information to run a segmenter, an automatic segmenter. Okay, so roughly we have those historically those small scale data sets à la MNIST and CIFAR, and then there was this revolution of ImageNet that completely changed the scale of the data set we were dealing with. And now there is the Cityscape and another one called MSCOCO, where you have the very fine annotation of the images to the pixel level. So let's go quickly through the tasks and the performance measures we can use to assess how well we are doing. So in image classification, we simply want to predict a finite value given the signal. So this is, for instance, MNIST or CIFAR. In which case it's reasonable to compute as a performance measure simply the error rate, which is the empirical probability to be wrong, so that the hard class, the class you predict is not the correct one, or conversely the accuracy, which is the probability to be correct. This is a very reasonable performance measure, except if the classes are highly unbalanced. So if you have 99% of your images of a certain class and 1% of the other, the just responding the dominant class will give you a 99% accuracy or 1% error, which is really absurd. So in that case, you would use the balanced error rate, which is you sum through the classes, you take the average through the classes of the probability to do a misprediction on that class. So you would go through all the images of background and compute how many times you say cat, and then you would go through all the images of cat, compute probability to say background, and take the averages to probabilities. In many situations, we have a class problem where we have one positive class and one negative. In that context, we can define the true positive rate, which is the probability to respond positive on a positive image, and the false positive rate, which is the probability to respond positive on a negative image. An ideal algorithm would do true positive 1 and false positive 0. But in practice, since you can't achieve this, what is a good trade-off depends with the application. So we can consider two examples. For instance, if you do cancer detection, you want a very low false negative. You want a very high true positive, so you don't want to miss any cancer, even if you have a high false positive, even if often you will predict cancer when there is none. Why? Because the algorithm will not make the final decision. If the algorithm predicts cancer, then it will trigger additional tests from oncologists and doctors. So it's far more costly to miss a cancer than to do a false positive. On the other hand, when you do image retrieval, it's the other way around, because given that if you have a very large data set, if somebody wants an image of the Eiffel Tower, it's not too bad to miss a lot of Eiffel Tower images, given you have so many in your data set, but it would be very bad to do a false positive, which is to show a picture of Notre Dame if the user is asking for Eiffel Tower. So given that it depends with the application, the standard way to represent the performance of an algorithm in all the regime is to plot a curve, for instance, the ROC curve, the receiver operating characteristic, where you are going to change your threshold And for each value of your decision threshold, you are going to compute the false positive rate and the true positive rate on the resulting curve. So to summarize, if I have a neural network that does the prediction in a two-class problem, for instance, so I have two units output, and I put an image as an input, and I have two output units. What I'm going to compute on each sample is, for instance, the difference between the two output units. This gives me a score. So if I take the score of unit 1 minus the score of unit 0, it makes sense that the higher the score, the more likely I am to be of class 1. And so what I can do is to set a threshold and say, okay, if the difference is above threshold rho, I'm going to predict class 1. If I'm below, I'm going to predict class 0. So if the threshold is extremely low, I'm going to always predict class 1, so I'm going to be there. With a very low threshold, I do a lot of false positive, so I'm very high in this direction and very high in this direction because I do a lot of false positive and a lot of true positive. If on the contrary I put my threshold super high, I'm going to respond always 0, and I will have a very low false positive, because of course I always predict 0, but I will also have a very low true positive. So the ideal case would be to be in the upper left corner, and when we move around, we see that indeed in that case we get close to the corner, but the best we can do is, for instance, 0.25 false positive for 97.5 true positive. A way of measuring the overall performance of this graph is to compute the area under the curve, which is the surface of the area under this red line, which of course is equal to 1 if you are in the top left corner, which is what you want. But in general, that does not make much sense because it's mixing in a balanced way all the false positive rates. So this is something really to take with extreme carefulness, because it makes poor sense to say that your algorithm is better because maybe he's putting the curve higher in this regime, even if it does very bad in the other. I mean, the area under the curve is used a lot, and it often makes little sense. So this is not the end of all things to have the greatest IoT. So this is for classification. For object detection, it's a bit more complicated. So in the object detection problem, task consists of, you are given an image where the ground truth consists of rectangles, or it can be the other way of the type of ground truth. But in the canonical setup, you have a bunch of rectangles in the scene corresponding to bounding boxes around targets. And your goal, you are given the image, and the goal is to predict a bunch of rectangles, each of them with a class, and to see how well you have hit the target. So now the problem that you need a criteria to decide if a detection actually corresponds to a true box, because you are usually slightly off. So the standard measurement to decide if a prediction corresponds to a true target is to look at the intersection of our union. So let's say that B is the true target, this is the ground truth, and B hat is what your algorithm predicted. You can, for instance, decide that it's a correct hit if the area of the intersection of the boxes, so this blue area, divided by the area of the union of the boxes, divided by the surface, the area of this blue area, is greater than, for instance, 1/2. So it's complicated to estimate the performance of a detection algorithm, because you have a bunch of boxes in the ground truth, each of them with a class, and then you have a bunch of boxes predicted by the algorithm, each of them with the probabilities over the classes, and you have in the end to say is it good or not. So plenty of things may happen. For instance, you may have two boxes for two predicted boxes for single predicted ground truth box. What should you do? So usually what we do is that we consider the best hit. If the best hit actually overlap enough, we say it's a correct detection. And now that this ground truth detection is taken, the second prediction, even if it's a correct one, even if it overlaps enough, is a false positive, because the true target was already hit by another detection. But okay, take-home message from this slide: the intersection over union is this measure, and it's a reasonable criterion to state that a predicted box actually hit ground truth box. And finally, the third task is image segmentation, for which you want to label individual pixels with a class. And it may also involve predicting the instance it belongs to. So you may not only want to predict this pixel belongs to a person, but also to this person. So if you have 5 people in the scene, you may want to say for each pixel that it belongs to a certain individual in the scene. On the standard performance measure, frames the task as a classification one. So you really see each pixel as an instance of something for which you have to predict the class. And then you estimate segmentation accuracy for a class as the number of pixels truly of that class which were predicted as such, divided by the number of pixels properly predicted plus the number of pixels wrongly predicted as this class. And this balance naturally with the surface of the class. Balancing properly in the class frequency in segmentation is very, very important. You can imagine, for instance, in a street scene that roads and buildings are dominant, but in terms of understanding the scene, lampposts and people and trees are also super important, even though they represent a fraction of the pixels. So this is one example where unbalanced class is super important and has to be dealt with very, very carefully. A general comment is that all these performance measures are extremely debatable. So again, area under the curve, or even a balanced rate, or all those things are not absolute things. And there are a lot of technical details, a lot of ways of computing them, a lot of bugs in the routines computing them. So they are debatable. But even if we can have this discussion, they still provide a proper sense of the progress of the field. So even though we can locally discuss and say, oh yeah, area under the curve makes no sense for this precise article, if you look at the trend over the years, you see that all those performance measures tend to increase, and it gives a sense of how well the field is doing. Okay, so we start with image classification, and we are going to go through the standard models to solve the problem. So the most standard networks for image classification are the LeNet family, so that developed by LeCun and al. And then the two modern extensions, which are AlexNet, the famous AlexNet from 2012, and then the VGGNet by Simonian and Zisserman. All those models share the common structure, which is a bunch of convolution layers, which can be seen as feature extractors. If we put this in the classical machine learning framework, where you have feature extraction and the decision. So in that perspective, networks are composed of convolution layers that do feature extraction, followed by fully connected layers, which act as a classifier. And as I said multiple times, AlexNet was really something for the computer vision community, because even though it's super simple conceptually, it vastly outperformed other methods that were developed at that time. And as we will see in those slides, the recent advances are moving from standard convolution layers to more complicated local architectures, and also, as we saw in the last lecture, the residual architectures. So in PyTorch, we have this very nice package called torchvision.models that provide basically all the standard reference networks for computer vision, and it's extremely easy to use. So you do import torchvision, and then if you do AlexNet equal torchvision.models.alexnet, now you have an AlexNet in this guy. And you can even give the argument pre-trained equal true, in which case PyTorch will download transparently a model from whatever the website it is available on, and cache it locally, and from then, every time you run your soft, it will reuse this local copy of the model already trained, which means you don't have to download ImageNet and to run heavy training to have an AlexNet operational for your application. One detail is that the networks which are implemented in PyTorch are some updated variants of what the model introduced historically. So really don't be surprised if you see some discrepancy between the models in PyTorch and what you may see in the articles. A good example is AlexNet, which was designed initially to be run on 2 GPUs in parallel, which involves some specific way of factoring the processing. on the PyTorch version is really straightforward ConvNet without any trick. So this is an example in PyTorch of a simple LeNet. So I think this one I really did by hand. It's not standard in PyTorch. So it's just to show what it looks like. So you have a convolution layer, kernel size 5, one channel because NIST is a one channel image, go to 6 channels. And then you do ReLU, max pooling, convolution with 5 filters to 16 channels, ReLU again, max pooling again. And then linear fully connected layers, ReLU, fully connected layers, ReLU, and fully connected layer. And as you see, we go from 400 dimensions when we enter the fully connected to the 10 final dimensions because we have 10 classes for CIFAR. Okay. If you look at the 89 papers and I think even the 90 papers, the paper from the 90s, there were some variants. For instance, there were like RBF neurons where it's not ReLU but it's a Gaussian, it's a kernel Gaussian activation. But this is really the canonical LeNet that performs reasonably well. And then we move to AlexNet. So it's just to show how similarities. It's again the same stuff: conv ReLU max pool, conv ReLU max pool, conv ReLU, conv ReLU, conv ReLU max pool. Just the precise order. It's always unclear how either it was a first try it worked or it was tuned a little bit. But this is the canonical model present in PyTorch, and it's followed by a bunch of fully connected layers. So here you can see it illustrates well what is the difference between neural networks from the late 80s, early 90s, and neural network from 2012, 2015. Just the size. So here we have 16 channels, 6 channels, 16 channels, 400 units when we enter the fully connected. Here we have 64, 192, 384, 256, 256. And so the memory footprint, the number of parameters, is proportional to the product of the kernels times the size of the filter. So here it's 1111, 121, and here we have 180. So we are talking about 20,000 parameters. And here now 64 times 200, we are talking times 55. So 25 times 60 times 200, 25 times 200 would be 5,000 times 64. We have 300,000 parameters. So this really it's quite big. And then you go to the fully connected where it goes from 9,000 units to 4,000. So it's a fully connected layer with 36 million parameters. And then you have a fully connected with 16 million parameters, and then another with 4 million parameters. So 4 plus 16 plus it's roughly 40 million parameters just for the fully connected layer. So it's quite huge. An important detail about the Krzyzewski et al. Training procedure, because it's a standard trick in computer vision, is the so-called data augmentation, where to mitigate a bit overfitting, you increase the size of your training set artificially by applying random deformation to your signal. So the idea that if you can come with a way of deforming your signal that you know should not change the value to predict, then you can apply this and it will just somehow increase artificially the size of your training set. So the transformation they used was cropping. So they were training on images of size, original size 256, 256, and they were cropping images of size 224, 224 at random, so with a bit of horizontal and vertical perturbation. And then they would randomly flip the image horizontally because it should not change the class. Vertically, it's another business because if you flip an image, you put the sky at the bottom, the ground at the top, or you put the head of the horse at the bottom and the legs of the horse at the top. That's a bit weird. But horizontally, it's reasonable to do it. And they were also applying a color transformation. They were doing a PCA model of the distribution and then applying some transformation of the colors. And also what they did during tests was to use the same stuff. So it's another trick you can use. If you have, again, a proper class of transformation that should keep the prediction unchanged, what you can do is to, every time you want to classify a sample, is to apply a bunch of those transformations to generate several samples, and then to average your prediction over those several samples to make your final prediction. Now we move to VGGNet from 2014, and again it's just the same business but bigger scale. So conv-ReLU, conv-ReLU maxpool, conv-ReLU, conv-ReLU maxpool, conv-ReLU, conv-ReLU, conv-ReLU maxpool, etc. A bunch of convolutional and ReLU and maxpooling layers. And then again a bunch of fully connected layers. And again it's bigger. So here we are talking 100 million parameters, 16 million parameters, 4 million parameters, so 120 million parameters. So all this being said, it's interesting to come back to how convenient those modern deep learning frameworks are, and especially PyTorch. So let's take a very simple problem. I have this picture of a dog. Actually, what I'm going to show, I initially did it with a picture I took on Google, and since it was working very well, I was suspicious that maybe the image was in ImageNet. So this is an image I took myself, no comment, don't ask me why I have a picture of a dog. But so this image, this for sure was not in the training set or in any set used for developing a network. And let's try to classify it with AlexNet. So the way we would do this would be we import the Python image library, the PyTorch on TorchVision. First, we would load the image. So pil.image.open blacklab return probably a NumPy tensor, which is my image. Then it returned an image that I transformed into a tensor with TorchVision.transform.toTensor. So when I'm leaving this line, when this line has been executed, I have a PyTorch tensor image, which is 3 channels, heights, widths containing my image. I reshape it to make it a batch of a single image. So I keep the number of channels, keep the height, keep the width, and just make it one more index, which is a single sample. And then what I do is simply subtract the mean, divide by the standard deviation, and force the mean 0.5 on across channels on the standard deviation 0.5. It's because the AlexNet in PyTorch was tuned for such a normalization. So here, those 3 lines, what they do, they load my JPEG image from the disk, reshape it as a batch of a single sample, and normalize the component to 0.505 in mean on standard deviation. Now, I take an AlexNet already trained, so TorchVision models AlexNet pre-trained equal true. So this is doing some magic. Just take a second to think about this. So here we have all those nice pieces of technology. We have Python, we have the internet, it's downloading stuff, everything completely transparently to you. In the end, you have this huge image processing model arriving in this variable thanks to all those marvels of technology. So I think we are a bit blasé about this. This is a bunch of miracles piped one after another happening. Then we put the network in eval mode because we want to use it for inference. So by default, models are in train mode. So you remember we have those batch normalization and dropout and other stuff which do not behave the same in test and in train. So here we say we want to use it for inference only. And here I'm just wrapping my tensor, my one sample batch tensor into a variable and sending it through AlexNet, and I get my output. Okay. AlexNet was trained on ImageNet, which means that my output is going to be a batch of a single vector of dimension 1000 corresponding to the 1000 classes of ImageNet. And now what I'm going to do is I'm reshaping, so I'm extracting the tensor from my output variable, making it, I drop the first index, which is the sample, because you have a single sample. So I'm making it, now when I'm reaching this point, I have a tensor of 1 dimension, 1000 values, and I'm sorting it in descending order. So I want to have first the indexes, so I will get the scores on the indexes starting from the high scores to the low scores, okay? I got from somewhere on the web this text file which has the class names for ImageNet. So you have 1,000 rows on the one word for each class. So I get this in a file, and now I have a list containing the names of the classes. And here what I'm going to do is to visit my classes. Since I ordered the scores on the indexes by decreasing order, I'm going to look at the 15 first classes with the highest score in order. Okay. So this piece of code, and really, if you have an image on your hard disk of size 224 to 24, you can really run this piece of code, and it will really take the image, run AlexNet, rank the scores according to AlexNet, and print the 15 first classes according to AlexNet with their scores. And this is what we get. So again, this is the image, and we get those 15 classes. So with a score of 1226, something called vMariner. I have no idea what it is, but we'll come back to this. Second class is a Chesapeake Bay Retriever. I'm not a dog person, but it starts to look like an animal, a dog. And then the third is Labrador Retriever. So again, I know nothing in dogs, but this looks hopefully like a Labrador, and actually it was a blind a dog being trained to be help for blind people, so it's very likely to be a Labrador. And then if we go down, we see that it's a bunch of dog breeds down to over here where it goes as bad as Barrow and Bucket and Soccer Ball. Okay. So now the question is, what are those two classes? So I went on the Intertubes and checked what is the vMariner and the Chesapeake Bay Retriever, and this is what I got. So I picked some puppies because this one was young. So, and we realized I don't know how much the dog person you are, but I would not do better than AlexNet on this one. If you show me this stuff, and this stuff, I would say Labrador in all the cases, or at least I would say all those are the same kind of things. So it's just to show that even though AlexNet is something dating back from 2012, and definitely not the state-of-the-art in terms of image classification, and maybe now, again, we are a bit blasé about this, but it really changed the situation from we have no way of automatically extracting semantic from images to a point where, even though we are far from human level intelligence, we can really do something. You could really take a bunch of images, send them through one of those networks, and what you get is usable for applications. Maybe not usable if you need 99.99% accuracy, but for many applications it's usable, and as you can see, it's super easy, very easy. So the tools we have at our disposal make it a piece of cake. A few lines of Python do the trick. Okay, so now we move to a technical point, which is something we see often, so it's interesting to make it clear, which is what are fully convolutional networks. So we saw that in most of the models I presented until now, we have this structure of convolution layers followed by fully connected layers. But in many applications that have been developed recently, those networks are made fully convolutional by converting their fully connected layers to a convolutional one. So the way we implement those networks, if you remember, we went through the convolution layers, which means we get a bunch of activation maps, and so a bunch of activation maps look like this. The tensor, which has a bunch of channels on the heights and widths. And at some point we reshape it into a single dimension vector, and then we take the inner product with a weight vector, and we get a single activation. Okay? And then actually we do this several times to get a bunch of activations. But if you do this, so if you take a tensor, reshape it to make it 1D, to take the inner product to weight vector to get a single activation, you could do exactly the same by taking the convolution between your original tensor and a filter of same size. So it's really a degenerated case of convolution, because if your filter has the same size as your input tensor, the convolution boils down to a simple dot product, because the filter cannot move around. So you get a single value, and it's actually exactly the definition of the dot product. And when you do the convolution, it analytically corresponds exactly to unfolding your local tensor into a 1D tensor and taking the dot product. And we can do this with multiple dimensions. So again, if you have your the output of your convolution layers, you reshape them into a single 1D vector, and then you have your weight vector of your fully connected layer to get a bunch of activations, and then your second fully connected layer would do the same. You would get a 1D vector corresponding to the output of this fully connected layer. You would have a bunch of weight vectors, and you would get the activations of the next fully connected layer. Okay, so you can do exactly the same trick. You can replace all your fully connected layers, all your the weight rows of your fully connected layer by a bunch of filters of same size as the input tensor. Again, so this guy converted by this guy gives you a single value, which is this one, which is exactly the same as the dot product between this guy and this guy, on the same next filter, next filter. So now, instead of getting a 1D vector, you get a bunch of channels of activation maps of size 1, 1. It may look like a stupid rephrasing of a stupid process empty of any sense. Exactly, it's just changing the shape of the tensors. But the thing is that then, when you want to take another fully connected layer, again, it can be seen as the convolution between this 1, 1 times 3 tensor by a filter which is 1, 1 times 3 and another filter 1, 1 times 3, and you get two values. Okay. So now, this convolutionalization does not change anything if the input size is such that the output has a single spatial cell. So here, doing all this just made those vectors, instead of being 1D vector, now they are a bunch of activation maps of size 1, 1. But the thing is that now imagine I'm feeding this vector with this model with a larger input of greater size. Now I got a prediction at every location just by applying my network directly without any change. So imagine that you have this model and you want to compute its response at multiple locations in an image. You would have somehow to extract this tensor at different locations in your input image and to do all this multiple times. By making it fully convolutional, you just apply it as a convolutional network, and you get in the end a bunch of activation maps corresponding to a 2D prediction at every location. Okay? And we will see it's quite important because it allows to reuse. So first, it reuse computation. So instead of, if you are computing the response of your network at several locations that overlaps, you would, if you were using the old the version where you crop a tensor from the input image to do the computation, you would not reuse computation. Here, with convolution, the computation is reused. If a certain convolution has to be done in several overlapping windows, by definition it has been reused. And also, it allows you to take a model such as AlexNet, for instance, and use it in a context where you want a decision at every location. And we'll come back to this because it's at the core of semantic segmentation. So here, to make these things more concrete, I wrote this little function that takes as input a bunch of layers, the size of the input tensor, and is going to return a model which is fully convolutional. So what I do is simply I'm going to create an empty list where I'm going to put my modules one after another. I create a dummy tensor of the right size because I will need to have this to size properly the fully connected layers when I meet them. Then I go through my layers. If a layer is not n-linear, I keep it. If a module is not n-linear, I keep it unchanged. But if it is a linear layer, what I do is that I replace it with a convolution layer, which has as many input channels as there were channels in the previous, in the current tensor. The number of output channels would be the dimension of my original linear layer, and the kernel size is the full size of my input tensor. So it's really the figures I showed in the previous slides. I create as many filters as I need output channels, which is the output dimensions. This. I create as many I have as many input channels as I had initially channels. on my kernel size is the full size of the tensor. So basically this convolution is degenerated in the sense it will not move around. The filter will just be taken, we'll take the dot product between the full filter, which is as big as the input tensor. And then I just recopy the weight on the bias directly in my filters. So here I exploit the fact that the view that I use here, the way it reshapes the filters, is the same as the original reshaping that would happen in AlexNet when you process a sample. It will shuffle, it will reorganize the coefficients the same way. So doing the reshaping over the filters and taking the convolution gives you the same result as reshaping the tensor and taking the dot product with a weight vector. And then I add this resulting layer, so I replace it in the case of linear by a convolution layer, and I put it in my list, and then I update the size of my tensor for continuing my loop, okay, and I return the list. So here now, I have a model AlexNet, I load it pre-trained, and I call my convolutionalize with the list of model features. So if you remember in AlexNet, we have a bunch of we have a sub-module called features that contains the convolution layers, and I make it a list, plus the modules into the fully connected part, which was called classifier. I make it a list, I concatenate the two, pass it to convolutionalize with the proper size of the input tensor, which is 3 channels to 24 images, and then I remake a new sequence of modules, a new model, which is the NN sequential built from the modules that my convolutionalize made. So first, the important technical detail that here I made the assumption that I only have to change n linear, which I'm not completely confident. So if you ever use this piece of code for serious stuff, if it blows in your face, check that there's no modules that I'm not aware of that should be convolutionized also, which are not taken into account here. So remember that the original AlexNet is like that, a bunch of convolution layers followed by a bunch of fully connected, and so when I apply my stuff, I get this. So we basically, it's quite trivial. We replace this linear that goes to 4,000 is over there, and then 4,000 is there, and 4,000 to 1,000 is there. So I'm just replacing again fully connected layers that goes from whatever to whatever by a convolution layer with a kernel size 1 that goes from the same dimension to the same dimension. So in their overfit approach from 2013, Sermanet and others combine this with the stride 1 final max pooling to get multiple predictions. So remember that with the AlexNet original paper, what they were doing was they would take the input image and take a bunch of crops, 5 sub-images taken at different locations, do the prediction for each. So they would apply, I show here in red, the actual computation. So for every location in the image, they would run their full network, convolution layers, max pooling, and fully connected layers to get their 1,000 dimensions. And what Sermanet and others proposed was, I'm going to push all my image through convolution layers, and then I'm just going to do my max pooling over by keeping the features, intermediate features computed only once. So there is fully reuse of the computation. Here, it's quite clear that in this approach, for every location, the intersection of this box with the other location where it is give you a sense of how much computation you are wasting. Here, you do this only once. You get the activation map on the complete image once for all, and then you move around and do your max pooling across those activation maps. By doing so, they reduce the computation a lot, which allowed them to run this process at 6 scales and to improve invariance, so they gained a little bit. So this convolutionalization has a practical consequence, as we can now reuse classification networks for dense prediction without retraining. And also, and we'll see this in the next course, even if the notions start to appear, this notion that there are features and then there is a classifier, I think it takes its roots in the standard machine learning, where there were predefined features and then the training part making the decision, the trained part making the decision. So we stayed in this framework, intellectual perception of things for a while, but now we see that it starts to be quite blurry because we just have a bunch of convolution layers, and at the end we have semantic information. So we start from low-level signal, a bunch of convolutions, and then we get semantic. And we will see that indeed when we look a bit at what is happening in the network, it's a kind of geometrical disentangling and information refinement going on, but there is not a clear cut. At some point I extract features and then I'm making a decision. And as we saw and we will see again today, in the case of a large output prediction map, a finite prediction can be obtained by averaging the final output map channel-wise. So imagine that you want to be able, because the fully convolutional networks allow to do so, imagine you want to deal with images of size not completely constant, so between 200 and 250, let's say, in its width and height. What you can do is to train your network on all those images together with a fully convolutional network that would produce final activation map of variable size, because if your input image is slightly larger, the final activation map would be slightly larger. But then the really final step in your network would compute the average per channel. So whatever are the size of the activation map, doing so you would get a 1D vector which has one activation per channel of the one before last layer, and then you would apply a final fully connected layer. So this is really the standard structure now. To summarize, you stack up a bunch of convolution layers, one after another, and the one before last layer would do channel averaging, so you go from activation maps to a single 1D vector which has as many dimensions as there were channels in the previous layer, and then you have a single fully connected layer to go from this 1D vector to the vector, the number of classes dimension. And because this averaging is linear, you of course do the averaging before the last fully connected. So first new idea that was used to improve performance of standard ConvNets was this idea of networks in networks. So we can consider a convolution layer as applying the same linear filter at every location. So it's really when you compute the value of an activation map in a layer, you are really applying a linear predictor to the values you extract from this area, from the receptive field, the corresponding receptive field in the previous activation maps. So a natural generalization would be, if you see this little thing as a convolution layer as applying this little classifier everywhere, why not using a more sophisticated one? So in particular, instead of using a linear predictor, we could use a multi-layer perceptron, such as this guy. So now, at every location, instead of extracting those values, doing a linear transformation and getting a single value, you would apply a fully connected layer, and then another fully connected layer, then you would get your final activation. Now, when you reformulate this with one-to-one convolutions, because this is what's going to happen, so you will have this guy is looking at a bunch of values, this guy is looking at a bunch of values, and you would now get a bunch of channels corresponding to the number of dimensions you have here, and then you would apply a bunch of one-time-one filters to get one of those guys, and you would do it again. So in the end, this applying a processing like this at every location is simply reformulated as combining a convolution with a filter of a certain size with a bunch of layers with one filters. So we could think, okay, why does it change? It simply changes the way you use your parameters, and it appears that this is an efficient way. With less parameters, you can reach as good performances as if you were just taking a bunch of convolution layers of filters which are not one by one. This idea was used in the series of models by Google, the Inception models on Google Net, where they either have modules of that form where you have a layer and you do in parallel several convolutions and then you do a concatenation of the results, or you do a kind of network in network where you do one convolutions followed by 3x3 convolutions. That allows, in the end, it's a better use of your parameters. Instead of having very large filters and a bunch of them to encompass in particular this kind of processing. Here you consider more constrained filter sizes and a constrained combination of those filters, because it makes sense. It allows in some way the model to pick automatically at what scale it wants to process the signal, because it has different filter size, and it also allows it to do fancier local computation with one-by-one convolution locally before continuing. So the final network was combining a bunch of layers like this and reached state-of-the-art performance at the time. Another idea introduced for those inception networks on GoogleNet was the idea of auxiliary classifier, where, so to train this huge network, instead of just putting the loss at the end, what you do is that you put auxiliary networks, this guy and this guy, that look at intermediate feature maps, and you already try to make the prediction from there. So it's another way of having the gradient not dying, because you reinject the gradient at different locations, and this is motivated by the fact that you can already reach reasonable performance at this level. So it means that the features already there can do a reasonable job. And this series of networks, as we will see, were then extended with batch normalization on the pass-through residual connections, like in residual networks. So maybe the most popular family of networks those days to do image classification are the so-called residual networks. So we saw last time in the last lecture what a residual network is. So the core idea is that instead of just stacking convolution, ReLU, convolution, ReLU, convolution, ReLU, what you do is that you organize them by blocks, and then you have a pass-through connection that directly keeps the signal unchanged and sum it at the end. So a typical residual block in a residual network looks like this. You take the signal unchanged and forward it. In parallel, you apply a convolution with a small filter, batch norm, ReLU, convolution with a small filter, batch norm, and then you sum the unchanged signal, and then you do ReLU. And if you remember, there are tricks when the size of the activation maps change, you do some subsampling over a regular grid, or when the number of channels increases, in which case you do 1-1 linear one convolution to increase or decrease the number of channels with a linear transformation. So if we take a block like this, you have two convolutional layers of filters 3x3 taking 64 channels as input, one bias and produce 64 channels as outputs. This gives you 73,000 parameters. But as observed by A. al. In their original paper, if you want to apply the same structure to ImageNet, you need to have more channels. So 64 channels is not enough. So you want to move to 256. The problem is that moving from 64 to 256 you have time for, because it's quadratic, because you multiply both the dimension of the number of channels in the filters and the number of filters. Now we are talking times 16, and you end up with 1.2 million parameters per block like this. And remember, a ResNet has between 10 and 50 or 200 such blocks, so it really completely explodes the number of parameters. And what they propose is something highly related to those networks and networks we talked about before, which is that they would, between blocks, keep this high number of channels, 256, which is what they move forward. But in the block itself, they first use a 1-1 filter to go 1-1 filters to go from 256 to 64 channels. So they reduce the number of channels. Then they do the usual batch norm ReLU, and then they do the convolution on those reduced channels. And then they re-upscale the number of channels. So here it's really, again, the kind of stuff we can only, in my opinion, have hand-wavy explanations about them, but it's really the information, you keep a large number of channels because you want to have pointwise rich information that you move through blocks. So the overall flow through the network has a very large information content at every point. But when you do some spatial reasoning, when you start to look at spatial structures, you do this with a smaller number of channels. And so you can really reduce the number of channels to do your spatial reasoning, and then you go back to a number of channels to provide. So it's really like Here we want to encode complicated pointwise information. And here, when we do the reasoning, the spatial reasoning, since we are looking at a bit more the spatial environment, we can do it with a smaller number of channels, and we re-increase the number of channels later. Okay, doing so, they are able to have 256 channels flowing through the network with only 70,000 parameters per block. So they decrease even the number of parameters from 73,000 to 70,000. So here in the original paper, you have a bunch of variants about how you can change the number of channels, number of filters. The good trade-off is with the values I gave before. And they reached something which is probably the state of the art. Now we can do a bit better, but as soon as you reach 3.5% in top 5 year on ImageNet, you're good. So this was in some way the state-of-the-art methods are ResNet, and this is the type of values you get. It was improved even a little bit later with the so-called aggregated pathways. So again, it's a very interesting approach where you go on constraining the way the information flows. So we went first by having this bottleneck. We reduce the number of channels before doing the spatial reasoning. Here what they do is that they even go one step further. Instead of going down to 64 channels, they go down to 4, but they do it several times. So instead of going 256 to 64 channels doing the reasoning and going back to 256, here what they do is that they go to 4 channels, do the spatial reasoning, and go back on some in the end. And when you equalize the number of parameters, so you can now, of course, have far more pathways of that sort because they are doing the convolution on a very small number of channels. In the end, you get better performance. So it seems that, again, on the way the explanation would be that you have a sort of factorization of the space, of the representation space that you need locally. Imagine intuitively it would be like maybe you need 4 components to capture the texture aspect, 4 components to capture the sort of horizontal edge, 4 components to capture the sort of I don't know, extension, second order thing, and in the end all those aspects should be processed separately. There is no gain allowing them to be combined. You can really do your reasoning 4 channels by 4 channels, and it's better to have more groups of 4 channels processed individually instead of 64 channels, 64 channels processed in jointly in one block. Okay, so to summarize all this, to summarize a bit what we have seen for networks for image classification, so the very standard one, again, AlexNet and VGNet, that are still used very often. So VGNet is really one of the cornerstone of computer vision. There are extensions of LeNet 5, which are just a bunch of convolution layers and a bunch of fully connected layers. All those networks are using ReLU, which was introduced in AlexNet. Actually, it was before the rectifiers, before AlexNet, but for vision, it was really in AlexNet that it became the standard. All those networks have hundreds of channels on tens of layers. This is it varies quite a lot from one network to another. This is the order of magnitude. They can, maybe they should be fully convolutional. We saw that pass-through connections allow deeper residual networks. And remember the previous lecture, we saw how efficient it was to allow very deep networks. We were able to train extremely deep networks thanks to this. Bottleneck local structures reduce the number of parameters, and aggregated pathways reduce the number of parameters. So those are, in some sense, what to take from those slides. This is what are the modern changes and perspective for networks for image classification. So I tried to summarize this zoology in this graph. So we start from LeNet. The Schmidhuber's group was the first to make them bigger on GPUs in 2012. And then by adding Dropout and ReLU, Krzyzewski made his big splash in 2012. From there, you had on one side the overfit by making them fully convolutional, and we'll come back to overfit for detection. By making the network even bigger and making the filters smaller, you get the VGG series of networks. By doing the network in network trick, you go to the inception modules on the inception series of networks that introduced batch norm in 2015. When you put together VGG for the small filters, batch norm, and also very important stuff coming again also from Schmidhuber's group. So we will come back to this on the course about recurrent neural network, but Schmidhuber introduced, Oschreiter and Schmidhuber introduced the idea of LSTM, which were units. So as I said already, people doing recurrent neural network had to face early all the issues of vanishing gradient and the difficulties of training super deep networks, because when you unfold the recurrent neural networks, you end up with a very deep network. So they introduced the idea of pass-through and gating and a lot of technologies to prevent this from happening. And what Schmidhuber's group did in 2015 was to take this idea of from LSTM, this idea of having a pass-through with a gating, and they created the highway net, which were the first networks with a very, very large number of layers. But it was even simplified to make the ResNet, where you remove the gating. And very interestingly, you go back to the original LSTM. So the LSTM people are familiar with as a gating, so the signal that flows through time is controlled through a unit. But if you look at the initial version of LSTM, it was there was no gating, so the signal would be kept and just summed after each time step. So it's exactly like the ResNet architecture. So ResNet takes this idea coming from the highway net without gating that comes from the Schmidhuber's family of things, VGGNet for the small filters, batch norm from inception, and you get the ResNet, which are probably the most efficient families of networks those days. So then you have the wider ResNet, which achieves state-of-the-art on CFAR, dense pass-through, where instead of just connecting one layer to the next, you can have pass-through that goes further blocks away, forward. The aggregated channels that I described, and then you add the ResNet connection added to Inception ResNet. And it has not changed so much since 2016. Now we are really gaining fraction of %. It's not clear there was really improvement. Conceptually, the simplest and the most efficient are probably the ResNext. Very, very good stuff. Okay, so now we move to object detection, which is a second task we are interested in today. So in object detection, you have a bunch of you have an image with a bunch of instances of the classes of interest. So here cows, and you want in the end to produce a bunch of bounding boxes with the class detected in them. So the historical way of doing this is the so-called sliding window strategy, where you train a predictor to say if the object is there or not. So a simple way of casting this would be you have, for instance, 20 classes of interest. You add a 21st class, which would be nothing or background, and then you move your predictor around at multiple locations, and then every time it hits something, you keep track of this detection and you continue. And then you reduce your image and do it again, you reduce your image and do it again, and at some point you have all the detection at all the scales. Okay? Your final list of detection will look like that. This sliding window approach evaluates the classifier multiple times, and its computational cost increases with the prediction accuracy. So if you want to have a finer precision, geometric precision, it means you have to have a finer number of computation. And the worst weakness of this approach is that you don't reuse computation. Again, if there's something highly unsatisfying that when you compute this guy and when you compute this guy, almost all the computation, if you are using a convolutional network, all the computation are shared. You should reuse all of them. So this idea of sharing computation is extremely natural. It was proposed by Sermanet in 2013. What they did was, as we saw for classification, this idea of having the max pooling after convolution layers and to get prediction. What they proposed for detection in the same paper was to also add a bunch of regression units. So now, every time they are moving so they compute the convolution, the activation maps over the whole image for all. Then they move around an image just on the feature maps, so they don't recompute this all the time. or that every location of their window, they can both compute a posterior distribution over the classes, 1000 dimensions, but what they do is also to add a bunch of layers to compute 4 values, which are the coordinates of the bounding box of the target they detect. So it's really a regression, fully connected layers to do a regression task. And if you apply this to those examples, you get those kind of prediction boxes. So for every location of your 224 image, you get a bunch of boxes, and then you have a post-processing with an ad hoc greedy algorithm that take a sort of an average of those boxes to make a final decision. Okay. So an important technical point is the negative samples, because you need to do a detection now. As I said, you had a background class, so you would have your 20 or your 1000 classes if it's ImageNet, and you had one class that says there is nothing there in this box. But then the problem is that if I give you images taken from the web or images from ImageNet, and you take at random windows where there are no objects, most of the sub-windows would be trivially rejected as non-object, because most of the non-object example would be very flat and very simple. And those are not the problematic ones. The problematic ones are when you have structure. So you have a piece of a tree, you have a piece of high-frequency stuff, like a bookshelf or whatever, and this will trigger a lot of false positives, and those are the ones you want to give during training as negative example. So every time you see work on detection, there is a mechanism for what's so-called hard sample mining, a way of taking samples which are hard to classify. The usual way is to do some form of bootstrapping. So you would run your classifier over a lot of examples that you know are negative, and just take the one where he believes there is an object as negative examples for improving the photo, for doing the gradient descent. An interesting fact from the Sermanes work that is something that has been observed many times then, so it's not just their algorithm or their framework that does this, is that using a class-specific localization layers does not help, which is very surprising. So you would expect that to predict the bounding box around a bird, you need something very different from what you need to predict the bounding box around a car or around a tree. But in practice, that's not the case. So you can really have a bunch of layers predicting the class, a bunch of layers predicting the bounding box, but those are two parallel pathways that do not communicate with each other. So then, in parallel to this work by Sermané and Lacombe's group, there was a completely different and extremely successful series of algorithms which was based on region proposal. So here, the way it appeared was highly related to the standard sliding window strategy. So if you do the sliding window way, so you visit all locations and all scale, it's too expensive. So a very natural strategy, which has been done a lot in the classical computer vision community, is to use some form of cascade. A cascade is a series of predictors which are more and more expensive computationally, but which are more and more accurate. So what you would do is to run the first classifier, and if the first, and you tune all of them to have a very low false negative rate, to have a very high true positive. So they do a lot of false positive, but you don't care. As soon as one classifier says that there may be the target, then you go to the next and you ask it, and then you go to the next and you ask it. And here they applied something in that spirit, by pre-processing the scene with the so-called objectness or region proposal algorithm. So a region proposal just takes a full image, and based on low-level signal processing criteria, is going to decide that certain areas of the scene are probably an object. It's basically looking for enough complexity in the structure. So what they did was to use a non-CNN objectness approach, so in that case a selective search which was published in 2013. They would take the scene, the image to process, they would send through this algorithm that would produce thousands of proposal bounding boxes, and then they would run an AlexNet-like network on each one of those boxes to check if there is actually an object. Then they improved, so this was the RCNN paper from 2013, and in 2015 they improved a little bit by, instead of running the full stack, the full convolution network from the cropped images, they would do the cropping and the rescaling in the convolutional feature map. So at least they would do a bit of the Sermané approach, the overfit approach, where they would put in common to all those boxes classification all the feature map computation. So fast, those were two hits. They work really well. But at this point, the bottleneck in terms of computation was the region proposal, because it's still expensive, and in particular, contrary to deep networks, it cannot be implemented efficiently on a GPU. So in faster RCNN, they replaced the region proposal algorithm with a convolution processing similar to overfit. So in the end, it was interesting, because on the one hand, you had Sermanet et al., who from the beginning proposed to have a fully convolutional regression-based algorithm to predict the location of the bounding boxes. And in parallel, there was all this lineage of algorithms that take its route into the sliding window, region proposal, cascade kind of stuff, really more the classical computer vision community. And in the end, they started to branch together, but remarkably, the fast RCNN branch was achieving better performance. So the most famous algorithm that comes from this series of work is the YOLO algorithm. You only look once, by Redmond and others. It was published in 2015. And it comes back to a classical convolutional architecture followed by fully connected layers, and it is described sometimes as the first one-shot detector, since it processes the image in a single information pathway. So you don't have those different things where you do the region proposal and so on. But again, it's very similar to the overfit approach. So YOLO, it's a kind of a UFO in the landscape, because this guy Redmond implemented fully a deep learning framework in low-level programming language in C. It's a bit complicated, because of course it's a hard task. And he implemented this full network, so with Ikirilu, he trained it from scratch. He took the one bottleneck filters from Lineal, and he did. So it's really a fantastic piece of work. So it's very efficient computationally, and reaching a very good performance, and done completely from scratch. It's absolutely remarkable. So the way YOLO works, it splits the input image into a grid of. So this could be. This is a meta parameter, but the default is 7 by 7 cells, so you have 49 cells. And what it's going to do is that on the one hand, it's going to predict for each one of those cells a bunch of boxes for objects that would have their center in this cell. And in parallel, it's going to produce for every cell a posterior distribution over the classes. And combining the two, you make a decision. So if you are enough confident that an object is present, then you would take the best estimate of a box as a prediction of where the object is located. So in practice, the way it's done, it's a fully connected. It's a convolution network similar to AlexNet, but at some point you reach a fully connected layer of dimension 4000 that then produce a tensor 7 by 7 by 30. So the meaning of this 7 by 7 by 30 is that 7 by 7 are the cells, and the 30 is both first C values corresponding to the class probabilities of Pascal VOC. So this is not ImageNet, this is another very, very famous data set with 20 classes. So for every one of those cells, the algorithm produces 20 posterior probabilities, one per class, and it's going to predict B candidate boxes, and for each box, the coordinate of the box, and the confidence that there is truly an object in there. In practice, there are only two boxes for this version of YOLO. Here I'm describing the first version of YOLO. Okay, so again, you have the image. It processes images RGB 448, 448. So there are twice the usual size for image classification. This is detection. Then it goes through a bunch of convolution layers with Ikirilu. At some point, it reaches a fully connected layer, and for this fully connected layer, it produces a 7 by 7 by 30 tensor, which correspond to 7 by 7 cells in the image, angular grid. And in each cell, you have 30 coordinates, those 30 coordinates being 20 probabilities corresponding to the 20 classes. So probability that it's a conditional probability in some sense. If there is an object in there, this is what I believe are the probability that it is of each class. So 20 values. And then two sets of 5 values, because b equal 2, and those 5 values are, for boxes, the coordinates, the geometric coordinate of the boxes, of each box, plus the confidence that there is truly an object in there. An interesting thing that I'm not clear if it's a good or bad thing, but actually it's a specificity, is that even though it's a convolutional processing that produces something that looks awfully like a bunch of activation maps, because it has a geometrical structure, it's 7 by 7 corresponding to the image support, it goes through a fully connected layer. So it allows in particular YOLO to leverage the absolute location in the image to improve performance. Since you have this fully connected layer that now is not, does not make any assumption of stationarity of the signal, you could have, for instance, YOLO, it probably actually exploits the fact that vehicles tend to be at the bottom, and the sky tends to be at the top, and the birds tend to be at the top, etc., etc. So you may or may not find this desirable, but in practice it may improve performance slightly in terms of error rate. So during training, YOLO makes the assumption that any of the S2 cells, so again this is YOLO version 1, I don't know for this, because there is a bunch of successors. It makes the assumption that any of the S2 cells contain at most the center of a single object. If you look in the code, if there are two objects hitting the same cell, the second is ignored, only the first is kept. And then for every image, every cell index I, every predicted box index j, and every class index, we have the following quantities. So one I object would be one, one if there is truly an object, sorry, if cell I, in cell I. One ij obj is one only if the predicted box j is the one matching the most the object in cell I. PIC is one if there is an object of class C in cell I, so this is the ground truth for the class. This is the ground truth for the box in this cell, and this is how much the predicted box j in this cell meets the true box. So there is something a bit strange in the training, in the sense that before processing every batch, it runs the prediction over this image and does all the processing of matching the predicted boxes, the ground truth, to compute this guy and this guy. Okay, so you take all your boxes and in a cell, if there is truly an object there, compute which one of your boxes match the most the ground truth. And you also compute how much each boxes fit the ground truth box. And now this is the loss, so the loss which is minimized during training. There is a component which is just if there is truly, if the predicted box j in cell I truly hit, there is truly a box in this cell, and this predicted one is the one that it hits the most, then we have a loss that pushes toward estimating properly the right location on the right side. Then you have a second term, which is if your box is truly hitting an object, if box j in cell I is truly hitting an object there, you want the confidence to predict. Remember that your network produces a fifth value for each box, which is the confidence. It has to be a good estimate of the intersection over union between your predicted box and the true box. And if there is no object, you want your confidence to go down to 0. And then, on top of this, you also want, if there is truly an object in the cell, that your estimated probability of the class is correct. And strangely, this is not cross-entropy, this is quadratic loss. Okay. So training YOLO relies on many engineering choices, and I like this example in this course because it illustrates how much there is an engineering, but really, again, in a very good sense. It's very nice to do math and stuff, but in the end, to make things work, you really have to trust your intuition and to tune and to make a lot of engineering choices. So here for YOLO, the network is pre-trained. The 21st convolution layers are pre-trained on ImageNet for classification. Then the scene is at higher resolution for detection compared to what it was for classification. It's leaky ReLU instead of ReLU. Dropout is used after the fully connected layers. The bounding boxes are normalized into 0. The bounding boxes geometrical parameters are normalized into 0, 1. There is a quadratic loss not only for the bounding box coordinate but also for the confidence on the class scores, probably because Even though conceptually it's a bit weird to have a quadratic loss for the distribution, it probably articulates better for the quadratic loss for the geometric part of the loss. The importance of large bounding box is controlled by using not difference between if you go back to the loss, here you see the square root of the width and square root of the height. It's simply that if you don't do this, the big boxes are going to take over and be the only one mattering in the loss. And also it has to be the weight of the different terms of the loss has to be chosen carefully, so that the confidence related, the empty cells are not taking completely, being too important in the loss when you do your optimization. And then momentum with 0.9 coefficient, decay 5 power to 10 to the power minus 4, and there was also data augmentation with scaling translation and HCSV transformation. The take-home message from this, so that it's very complicated, and it was done in a very nice manner to design a loss that is able to combine all those aspects of and disconnect with what I was saying initially. It's super hard to assess if you are doing a good job in detection, and this translates in the loss. It's super hard to design the loss because you want so many things at the same time. You want the right boxes to be predicted, you want the right class to be predicted, you want the boxes to be well located, and you want all this together. And is it better to predict that the umbrella is a bit less of an umbrella, but the box is better? And so you want to articulate all this properly, and it's quite difficult. And in practice, YOLO is a fantastic algorithm. So YOLO on Suns, really download it. They are available in open source implementations, and they work in real time. They are super efficient. Really very, very nice piece of software. The successor of the current modern detectors are the so-called single-shot multi-box detector, SSD, proposed in 2015. So they go back to a simpler architecture where it's a fully convolutional network, and what they do, so they take the VGG layers and then they alternate reducing the size to have some sort of multi-scale visit of the scene, and for every scale they just produce at every location 4 boxes on class and also distribution over classes. So it's really similar, it's really close to YOLO, except that you don't have this fully connected layer, and they do they predict a far greater number of boxes, but in concept it's very similar. So this one you can find also in implementation for open source and in PyTorch, exactly the model of the paper. So to summarize roughly how the one-shot deep detection can be achieved, so first, remarkably, and I think it's far from intuitive, networks which are trained on image classification capture localization information, and you can simply attach regression layers to those guys to predict geometrical quantities regarding the location of the targets. You can do object localization without being class specific, which I think is also extremely counterintuitive. I would expect that you really need to have a localizer for cars, which is very different from a localizer for birds, which is very different from a localizer for umbrella. And all those techniques, and even more recent ones, they tend to predict a lot of boxes at every location. So typically in SSD, what they do is that you produce at every location 4 quantities corresponding to location and scale of the boxes, and it was also the same for YOLO. Those location and scales are relative to absolute quantity specific to this location in the image. So for SSD, at every location, you are going not to predict the absolute location heights and widths of the box, but actually a location relative to the location you are processing in this activation map. And the heights and widths are going to be relative to a little dictionary of shapes. So they have at every location 4 shapes corresponding to 4 different aspect ratio. And each one of the 4 boxes you predict, for each one you predict 4 values, are relative to those aspect ratio. So you kind of hard code that there are different type of aspect ratio on size of boxes, on the location of boxes in the image. So now we can try to summarize a little bit the zoo of detectors. So as I was saying, everything starts from AlexNet, then you have the overfit paper by Sermanet and the LeCun group in 2013 that does directly the regression of the boxes through as a regression task by adding regression layers to the network. And then by doing it multi-scale convolutions on multi-boxes, you get SSD. And on the other side, at the same time, there was this RCNN with region proposal on cropping directly the image and feeding them to a network. Then instead of cropping in the image, you crop in the feature maps. Then instead of using a region proposal through an ad hoc external algorithm, you do it through convolutions, which allows to speed it up. And then by removing the cropping and directly doing the feed-forward processing in a unified manner, you get YOLO. And if you do fully convolutional multi-scale maps, you get SSD. So this is probably simpler conceptually than the other ones. So the third task we are going to see today is semantic segmentation. So semantic segmentation consists of predicting for every pixel a class it belongs to. So in some way, it's a more sophisticated task because it's at the same time a classification process on an extremely fine geometrical prediction. So historically, segmentation was really seen more as a signal processing problem. The goal was to group together pixels which were looking similar in some way. And so the standard way was to extract a feature representation at every pixel and then to group them based on both this similarity, visual similarity, and regularity in the image plan. But of course, such an approach accounts very poorly for the semantic content of your image. So for instance, if you have a sweatshirt made of two halves of different colors, it's extremely difficult for something based only on the local appearance of pixels to rely that it should put those two halves together because it's one person and this is the body of somebody. So the deep learning approach recasts semantic segmentation as pixel classification. So instead of basing this on designing a similarity measure and then grouping pixels, you simply directly use a fully convolutional network and expect your network to produce one class per pixel in the end. So the standard approach proposed in 2016 used the pre-trained classification network, in that case the VGG16, from which the final fully connected layers is removed, and actually the other fully connected layers are made into 1-1 convolution filters. And then they had the final 1-1 convolution layers that goes to the number of classes in VOC. So you really make VGG fully convolutional, remove the last fully connected layer, and replace it with a 1-1 convolution layer that goes to 21 classes. And then there is a final need for upscaling because the VGG is reducing through max pooling, is reducing the image size. So at the end, you have to have a way of expanding the image to its original size. Because what you have at the end of this VGG process is something which is 1 to 22 size of the original image. So to do this upscaling, there is a deconvolution layer with kernel 64 on the stride 3232. So you go from your image, which is 32 times smaller, to a final decision of the same size by having again a deconvolution layer that does this. The training is achieved with full images and pixel-wise cross-entropy, starting with a pre-trained VGG. So it's really a classification process. You consider that you should predict properly the class according to cross-entropy at every single pixel. All layers are fine-tuned, even though you could fix upscaling at the end to a bilinear upscaling deconvolution. It will work as well. So you don't have to fine-tune so much the final upscaling. So in the end, the model looks like this. You have a three-channel tensor as input. Those are the VGG layers. So you do multiple times convolution ReLU, then max pooling, multiple convolution ReLU, max pooling, again and again and again, and then you have your fully connected made convolutional layer that goes to 4,000 dimensions per location, because this was in the original VGNet, this would be the final encoding you have before making your final class prediction. And then you have one more so-called fully connected convolution. So this is a weird term, but it means that we have 1-1 filters, which for this layer were really converted from the fully connected layers in VGG. And then you go from those 4,000 dimension channels to 21 classes, which are the VOC plus background. And then you have a deconvolution or a bilinear interpolation to go back to the size of the image. So this fully connected network for segmentation achieved almost state-of-the-art result when published. The main weakness comes from the coarseness of the signal from which the final output is produced, because you go down to 1/32th the size of the original resolution, and then you expand without additional information. Do you really try to do the upscaling in a completely geometry-based criteria? You have no additional information to help you make a better description at a finer scale. So what they propose, and it's quite a standard type of processing to do this, to go to low scale and re-upscale, is to have pass through to take certain resolution and to move it forward to the same resolution at the end. So you really have, through the max pooling on the convolution of VGG, you go down to 1/32 the original size, and then you re-upscale progressively by having the convolution, and you add the map from the same size you had previously in the network when you reach the same resolution. So you take this size and you add it there, and you take this size and you add it there, and then finally do your deconvolution. Doing so gives extremely good results. So again, you can train this end-to-end with cross entropy. And this is the result from the best network they got. This is the ground truth, this is the input image, and it works beautifully. So it's really it's able to detect very finely the class of the pixels. And a very interesting experiment is that they train and test it also with images for which they completely discard the RGB information. They just keep the mask from the ground truth. So the network would be trained with images like this, and those are test images, and when you feed it to the network, it's able, only based on the shape of the silhouette, to predict that this is a human and this is a bike. And that's quite impressive, or to predict that this is a TV and this is a bottle. It's to show, this is to make very clear that what the convex is able to achieve, which was really not possible with classical segmentation. Here you are really able to capture semantic from global shape information in the image. So something quite important from what we saw is that both for detection and semantic segmentation, there is a heavy reuse of large networks trained for classification. So something to keep in mind is that even though what we are trying to achieve is to design better algorithms to produce good predictors, the predictors themselves have a very high value. So if you are able to make a very good network, in some way, even if you do it with a lot of manual intervention and a lot of changes in your code, and I would say something that may sound atrocious to some, but even if you are not able to reproduce the training, even if the end product is simply a model that you have saved to disk, if this model is very good, it's useful. Even if you suffer from amnesia, you have no idea how you produced it, you completely forgot. If the model is good, it's a very important asset in itself. It can be reused as itself. Okay, so now we will finish this lecture with a description of the data loader and a bit of programming in PyTorch to make a weird network. So first, the data loader. So until now, what we have done is to store the datasets as tensors. So if you remember, typically from NIST, we would get the dataset from Vision and likely build a variable for the reshaped tensor. But for very large datasets such as the image, you can simply not do this. You have several tens of gigabytes of data stored on disk. So there is no way you could have all this in memory. So The only way to deal with this is to fetch the images for every batch from the disk. But then you have to face the problem that you would like in parallel to do some processing on the GPU and do the fetching from the disk and make some pre-processing with the CPU at the same time. So you want to do this concurrently. It requires a bit of technicity. And then maybe what you want to do is to use a multi-thread in the way you are processing the images in CPU, etc., etc. So in the end, the machinery you need to do this, so to have in parallel the training going on the loading the data from disk, is quite sophisticated, and it's quite complicated to do it yourself. So it's why PyTorch provides very handy tools to do so. So the class utils.data.dataloader combines a dataset with a sampling policy to create an iterator over mini batches, and all the standard datasets are available in Torch Vision, and they allow to apply transformation over the image or the labels transparently. So let's take a very simple example. If we want to do this from NIST, so we would import from Torch Util data the data loader, from Torch Vision the datasets and transformation. Then we would define what transformation we want to apply to every image we load. So we want, in that case, to first pad the image with 3 pixels on all sides, and then crop inside an image 2028 at random in it. Then we want to make it a tensor, then we want to normalize. The meaning of normalize is the parameters of normalize are quite weird. It's not the target mean you want on the target standard deviation, it's the actual mean standard deviation of the dataset. So you have to know it. Either you do it once for all, you load your dataset, compute the mean and variance, and how to put this value in the code, or you get it from somewhere on the web where people have already done this. But again, this parameter is not the target mean on the target standard deviation, but the current mean on the current standard deviation, and it will be normalized to 0 and 1. So now that we have defined a transformation, which is a composition of those 3 transformations, what we do is to build a data loader. So data loader, we first describe a data set in which we state if we want the training set or the test set, if we want to download it, if it's not already there, and what transformation we want to apply. Then we are going to state that we want to have batch size, mini batch size 100. We allow the system to use 4 threads in parallel. We want to shuffle the data at the beginning of every epoch. This argument states that we want the data to be at fixed location in memory, which improves the performance when you move the tensor to the GPU. So you should do this if you are going to use CUDA, which is why here it's equal to torch.cuda is available. So all this being done, now it's quite easy. If I want to use my loader, I'm going to do multiple epochs, and for every epoch, I'm going to have an iterator built from my train loader. And every time I call my iterator, I get a pair of an input tensor and a target tensor. If I have CUDA, I move them to the GPU, then I make the variables, and then I do my usual stuff. I forward them in the model, compute the loss, set the gradient to 0, backward the derivative of the loss, do my optimizer step. So note that if your dataset is so small that it can fit in memory, or if you are super rich and you have gigabytes of memory, this is quite inefficient. So from my experiments, if I remember well, doing this with NIST would make everything twice slower. Now to be checked with more recent version of PyTorch, but again, if everything can fit in memory, you should not have multiple disk access all the time. Okay, to finish, just an example of complicated model programming and model training. So imagine I want to do the following. I want to build and train a network, which is, I want to do this on CIFAR 10, and I want my network to be composed of the first layer of AlexNet, already trained. Then I want to have several residual blocks. I want to store them in an NN module list, and each is going to combine conv2d, batchnorm2d, and ReLU. I want to have at the end a channel-wise averaging. As I said, for a ResNet it's reasonable. You are going, since the ResNet is going to keep the resolution unchanged, just before the decision you are going to have a bunch of activation maps. You have to make them a single 1D vector to do your final prediction. So in the end, after this averaging, we will have a fully connected layer. And during training, we want to keep the AlexNet features frozen for a few epochs, and then we want to relax it. So the way we are going to do this is by setting requires grad authoritative parameters to false. If you do this, the gradient will not be updated and they will be set to 0, and then the gradient step will not change then. Okay, so let's put all this together. This is my way of doing things. I have an environment variable that tells me where I put my PyTorch data. This is called data_dir. I say that I will use 4 threads. I want a batch size of 64. I'm not going to do any normalization. I just take the data and do the transfers. I create my tool data loader for training and test. So train false, train true. Okay. So now at the end of this, I have 2 data loaders for test and train. Then I'm writing this little function that builds one residual block. So residual block is a sequence. So n.sequential is a module in which you can put other modules, and the resulting module is just applying those processing one after another. So the block is composed of a convolution layer, which has a padding equal to half the filter size to maintain the activation map size, then batch norm, ReLU, conv layer, batch norm again. And then here is my model, so called monster. So first I load an AlexNet pre-trained. Then I have coded the number of channels from AlexNet on the feature map size, given the input size 3232. So I create a feature extractor which is composed of the first layer of AlexNet followed by ReLU. Then I have a converter that converts this to the proper number of channels and the proper size for my residual blocks. Then I have my residual blocks, which are just, I put them in a module list, as many of them. So I do a loop NB residual blocks, and for every I call my method, my function that creates a block. Putting them in a module list will allow PyTorch to know that those modules are there, especially when you are going to call parameters or other functions that really need to know what are the modules recursively. So for instance, if you want to switch your model to the train mode or eval mode, this will be done transparently. And finally, I'm going to do the average pooling over the full map size that I have maintained. And then I'm going to do my fully connected layer at the end, taking the number of channels and making predicting 10 classes corresponding to 10 CFAR classes. So it's just here, maybe it goes a bit fast, go through it carefully, but it's simply to show that we can get layers from another network, we can build a bunch of modules and store them in a module list, and we can easily do some a bit of cooking to convert the size of the layers so that they can fit together. Then I'm defining this method that allows me to freeze the features. So remember, we have this feature model that contains the AlexNet first feature layer on the ReLU. And if you call it with true, it means that you want to freeze those layers, in which case I set the requires grad to not Q. So if you pass it true, I don't want the gradient. If you pass it false, I want the gradient. And now what does the forward look like? I first apply my feature modules, and I convert to prepare for my ResNet blocks. Then I do my ResNet blocks. So this is the residual. It's I go through the block, but I also add the signal as it was before. Then I do my final averaging per channel and this size into a YD vector. I do my fully connected, and I return the result. And the training now looks like that. It's simply number of epochs, how many times I'm going to freeze AlexNet features, so I decide arbitrarily it is going to be half the epochs, how many residual blocks, how many channels, and so the thing is at the beginning of the epochs, so first I put my model in train, this is done by default, but then I freeze, if I have done less than half the epochs, I freeze the features, so this will call recursively into the feature module of my network and put the required gradient to false. And then I do my usual stuff. So I get my input and target tensor from the loader, move them to the GPU, make them variable, compute my output, compute my loss, and also accumulate my loss to have a monitoring. And this is the test. On the test again, I do I iterate through the test loader. Okay, so I realized maybe this was a bit much in a few slides, but simply that you can go through it and just to show the kind of stuff we can do easily. We can very easily reuse layers and convert them and freeze layers and do this kind of machinery to reuse existing models. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks again for your attention, and again, do not hesitate to drop me a mail for any question. Bye bye.